Helen entered the world with a cry, but her arrival brought more tears than joy. Her mother passed away moments after giving birth to her, leaving Kofi, her father, to cradle his baby girl with a heavy heart. Despite his sorrow, Kofi vowed to raise Helen with love and care. Life in Bepawazi, a lively village with crowded markets and colorful festivals, wasn't easy for a single father. When Helen turned 2, Kofi decided to remarry. He met Araba, a widow known for her calm demeanor and warm smile. At first, Araba was everything Helen needed. She sang her lullabies, braided her hair, and even called her "my little angel." But everything changed when Eric was born. Kofi was overjoyed to have a son, but Araba's attention shifted entirely to her baby boy. Helen, once the center of Araba's world, became invisible. One day, as Kofi prepared for another business trip, he noticed Helen sitting alone by the kitchen door. "Helen, my dear, come here," he said, lifting her onto his lap. "Papa," Helen whispered, "why does Mama Araba only play with Eric?" Kofi sighed and stroked her hair. "Your stepmother loves you too, Helen. She's just busy with the baby." Helen nodded, but deep down, she felt the truth. When Kofi was home, Araba made an effort to hide her true feelings. She would cook Helen's favorite meals and smile brightly whenever he looked her way. But as soon as Kofi left for work, her tone changed. "Helen, why are you just sitting there? Sweep the floor, and don't forget the laundry," Araba barked one afternoon. "Yes, Mama," Helen replied quietly, grabbing the broom with her small hands. Eric, who was only 5 but already spoiled, strutted into the room with a smirk. "Mama, Helen broke my toy," he lied, holding up a wooden car with a missing wheel. "Did you?" Araba's sharp eyes turned to Helen. "No, Mama, I didn't." "Enough," Araba snapped. "Apologize to your brother." "But I didn't." "Now!" With tears in her eyes, Helen muttered, "I'm sorry, Eric." Eric grinned victoriously as Araba patted his head. "Good boy," she said, ignoring Helen's sadness. Helen's only refuge was her studies. She loved reading and often stayed up late practicing her writing under the flicker of a kerosene lamp. Kofi noticed her dedication and often praised her. "Helen," he said one evening, "you're going to do great things. Maybe you'll even become a doctor someday." "Really, Papa?" Helen beamed. "Yes, my darling. You're so smart. I'm proud of you." These words filled Helen with hope, but they also fueled Araba's resentment. "A girl doesn't need education," Araba muttered to herself, watching Helen with narrowed eyes. Unlike his elder sister, Eric's mischief was a constant source of trouble. He would break things around the house, tease the neighbors' children, and play pranks that left everyone frustrated. Whenever Kofi tried to discipline him, Araba would rush in, defending her son. "You can't be too harsh on him," she would say, her voice sharp. "He's just a boy." Kofi's face would flush with anger. "A boy needs to learn respect, Araba." "I don't want to hear this again, Kofi." Araba would snap, her eyes glaring. This has always been a source of argument for the couple. When Helen turned 11, Kofi left for a business trip, promising to return with gifts. But he never came back. A messenger arrived with the heartbreaking news. Kofi had been in a car accident and didn't survive. The family was shattered, but no one felt the loss more deeply than Helen. She cried for days, clutching her father's old scarf as if it could bring him back. Araba, however, wasted no time in showing her true colors. "You think you're special because your father liked you?" she sneered one evening. "Well, he's gone now. You're just a burden." The next day, Araba began spreading whispers. "That girl is cursed," she told the neighbors. First her mother, now her father. Anyone close to her meets disaster. The villagers, who loved gossip, soon began avoiding Helen. Children stopped playing with her, and shopkeepers refused to meet her eyes. Helen walked through the village one morning, feeling the weight of their stares. "Why are they looking at me like that?" she wondered aloud. A woman passing by murmured to her friend, "Stay away from her. Bad luck follows her everywhere." Helen ran back home, her heart heavy with confusion and pain. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, about the cruel rumors, but who would believe her? At home, Araba gave her a list of chores. "Stop standing around like a useless tree and get to work," she ordered. Helen nodded silently, hiding her tears. She missed her father more than ever. As the sun set, Helen sat by the window, staring at the stars. "Papa," she whispered, "if you were here, everything would be okay. I miss you." But the stars gave no answer, and Helen knew she had to face the darkness alone. Life for Helen turned bleak after her father's death. Araba wasted no time asserting her control. One morning, as Helen prepared to go to school, Araba stood in her way. "Where do you think you're going?" Araba asked, arms crossed. "To school, Mama," Helen replied softly, clutching her books. "School? Ha! I can't afford to pay fees for 2 children," Araba said, pointing at Eric, who sat munching on roasted plantains. "Eric's education is more important. You're better off learning how to cook and clean." "But Papa wanted me to study," Helen protested. "Enough!" Araba's voice was sharp. "Go to the kitchen and start peeling those yams." Tears welled up in Helen's eyes, but she obeyed. From that day on, her school books remained untouched, gathering dust in the corner of her room. Years passed, and Helen's days were filled with endless chores. She scrubbed floors, washed clothes, and cooked meals, often under Araba's watchful eyes. One afternoon, Helen accidentally spilled a pot of soup while carrying it to the table. "Look at this mess!" Araba shouted, grabbing a cane. "You're useless." "I'm sorry, Mama," Helen cried, but Araba struck her across the back. Eric, now a cocky teenager, watched with a smirk. "Careful, Helen," he teased. "You might curse the soup too." Helen bit her lip, holding back her tears. Despite everything, Helen tried to stay strong. Her gentle nature and intelligence shone through in small ways. She helped the younger children in the village with their lessons when no one was watching and sang softly to herself while working. But even her small moments of happiness seemed to irritate Araba. "She's growing too beautiful," Araba muttered to herself one day as she watched Helen hang clothes to dry. The girl, now 17, had blossomed into a striking young woman with a quiet grace that turned heads in the village. Araba felt a surge of jealousy. What if Helen tried to claim Kofi's property when she turned 18? Araba couldn't let that happen. That evening, Araba pulled out a small box of jewelry she rarely wore. As Eric ate his dinner, she leaned close and whispered, "Tomorrow, we'll teach Helen a lesson she'll never forget." The next morning, Araba called Helen into the living room. "Where is my gold necklace?" she demanded, holding up the empty box. "I don't know, Mama," Helen said, confused. "Liar!" Araba screamed. "You stole it. I've had enough of your wicked ways." Eric joined in. "I saw her looking at it yesterday," he lied, crossing his arms. "No, I didn't," Helen cried, her voice trembling. But Araba wouldn't listen. She grabbed Helen by the arm and dragged her to the center of the village. "Thief!" Araba shouted, gathering a crowd. "This girl stole from me." The villagers, already wary of Helen because of the rumors Araba had spread, looked on with disapproval. "Didn't she bring bad luck to her own parents?" one woman murmured. "She's cursed," another agreed, turning away. Helen's heart broke as the people she had once smiled at now whispered cruel words about her. "Please, Mama, I didn't take it," Helen pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Leave this house," Araba screamed. "You're no longer welcome under my roof." With nowhere else to go, Helen ran. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the forest. Exhausted and sobbing, she collapsed near an old abandoned shed. The shed was small and dusty, with a leaky roof and broken windows. But it was a shelter, and Helen had no choice but to stay. Alone and hungry, Helen ventured into the forest to find food. She discovered wild fruits, nuts, and herbs, learning to identify which plants were safe to eat. Over time, she noticed that some leaves eased her headaches, while others soothed her cuts. One evening, as she sat by the shed's entrance, a bird with a broken wing landed nearby. Gently, Helen picked it up and wrapped its wing with a strip of cloth. "You're hurt too," she whispered, stroking its feathers. The bird stayed with her, and she found comfort in its presence. Days turned into weeks, and Helen began to find purpose in her solitude. She remembered stories her father had told her about plants and their uses. Slowly, she taught herself to mix herbs to create remedies for minor ailments. Though her heart still ached from the betrayal, Helen promised herself one thing: she would survive, and one day, she would prove everyone wrong. It's been a year since Helen started living in the forest. Her days in the forest were quiet and lonely, but she had grown used to it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, she heard a faint groan. At first, she thought it was an animal, but the sound came again, low and filled with pain. Curious and cautious, Helen followed the noise. At the forest's edge, she found a young man lying on the ground. His clothes were torn, and blood seeped from a wound on his side. His face was pale, and his breathing was shallow. "Who are you?" Helen whispered, kneeling beside him. The man didn't respond. His eyes fluttered open briefly, but he was too weak to speak. I need to help him, Helen decided, her heart pounding. Using all her strength, she dragged him to the old shed. She laid him on a mat and quickly gathered herbs and clean water. Remembering what she had learned, Helen pressed leaves against his wound to stop the bleeding. "Please don't die," she murmured as she worked. For 2 days, Helen cared for the stranger. She cleaned his wounds, gave him water, and whispered words of encouragement. On the 3rd day, the man's eyes finally opened fully. Where am I?" he asked weakly. "You're safe," Helen said, smiling softly. "I found you in the forest. Do you remember what happened?" The man frowned, his brow furrowing. I don't know. I can't remember anything." Helen's smile faded. "Not even your name?" He shook his head. "Then I'll call you Kojo," Helen said after a moment of thought. "It's a strong name." "Kojo," he repeated, as if testing it out. "Thank you for helping me." Days turned into weeks as Helen helped Kojo recover. She shared her simple meals with him, and they spent hours talking. "Did you build this shed yourself?" Kojo asked one evening as they sat outside, watching the stars. "No," Helen replied. "I found it when I had nowhere else to go." Kojo looked at her, sensing her sadness. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met," he said softly. Helen blushed and changed the subject. "What about you? Do you think your memory will come back?" "I don't know," Kojo admitted. "But even if it doesn't, I'm happy here, with you." For the first time in years, Helen felt truly happy. Kojo's jokes made her laugh, and his kindness warmed her heart. He helped her gather fruits and herbs, often teasing her about her serious nature. "You need to smile more," he said one day, gently poking her cheek. "I do smile," Helen protested, laughing. As the weeks passed, Kojo's strength returned. He began to remember little things: a flash of a tall building, the sound of a car engine, the scent of expensive cologne. Then, one afternoon, their peaceful world was shattered. Helen was outside washing clothes when she heard voices, loud and unfamiliar. She froze as 3 men appeared, their faces serious. "There you are," one of them said, pointing at Kojo, who had stepped outside the shed. Kojo's eyes widened. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice tense. "We work for your father," the man said. "We've been looking for you everywhere, Michael." Michael's memories came rushing back. He was the son of a wealthy businessman, and he had been attacked by rivals who wanted to destroy his family's company. I remember now," he said, his voice filled with shock. Helen stood silently, her heart sinking. Michael turned to her, his expression torn. "Helen, I have to go back. My family needs me." Tears filled Helen's eyes, but she nodded. "I understand." Michael took her hands in his. "I promise I'll come back for you. You've given me a second chance at life, and I won't forget that." The men led Michael away, leaving Helen standing by the shed. As the sound of their footsteps faded, the forest felt emptier than ever. Helen sat on the ground, her tears falling freely. "Maybe I really am cursed," she whispered. "Everyone I care about always leaves." But deep down, a small spark of hope remained. Michael's promise echoed in her mind. "I will come back for you, Helen." She clung to those words, even as loneliness settled over her once again. Michael's return to the city was overwhelming. Memories of his luxurious life came back in waves: grand buildings, sleek cars, and bustling streets. Yet, all he could think about was Helen. She had saved him, a stranger, with nothing to offer in return. He owed her everything. As he recovered, Michael began investigating his past. He discovered the truth about the attack: jealous rivals who wanted his business empire to crumble. Fueled by anger and determination, Michael used his influence to bring them to justice. Police arrested the culprits, and the courts handed them harsh sentences. But Michael wasn't done. "I need to find out more about Helen's life," he told his assistant Samuel. "I want to know why someone as kind as her ended up in that forest." Weeks later, Samuel returned with a grim report. "Sir, Helen's stepmother, Araba, spread rumors about her being cursed. She stopped Helen from going to school and made her a servant. She even accused Helen of stealing, forcing her to flee the village." Michael clenched his fists. "And the villagers? They believed Araba's lies?" Samuel nodded. "Yes, no one stood up for Helen." Michael's face hardened. "They will pay for what they've done." Using his connections, Michael arranged for Araba to be confronted publicly. When he returned to the village with proof of Araba's deeds, he called a meeting in the village square. The entire community gathered, curious and uneasy. "Today, the truth will be revealed," Michael announced, his voice loud and firm. Araba was dragged to the center of the square, trembling as villagers whispered around her. Michael read out the accusations: stealing Helen's inheritance, abusing her, and spreading cruel lies. "Is this true, Araba?" the village elder demanded, his face stern. Araba tried to deny it. "Lies! All lies!" she cried. But Michael had brought witnesses. Neighbors who had seen Helen's suffering and documents proving her rightful claim to Kofi's property. The crowd erupted in anger. "How could you do this to a child?" one woman shouted. "You made us believe she was cursed," another yelled. The elder raised his hand for silence. "Araba, your wickedness has brought shame to this village. As punishment, you are banished from our community. You will live on the outskirts, away from us all." The villagers cheered at the decision. Araba fell to her knees, begging for mercy. "Please, I have nowhere to go." The elder's voice was cold. "You showed no mercy to Helen. Now you must face the consequences of your actions." Eric, watching from the crowd, tried to defend his mother. "She's my mother. You can't do this." But the villagers turned on him too. "You're just as bad as her, Eric," one man said. "Get out of here." Araba and Eric were forced to leave the village that day, carrying only what they could hold. They moved into a shabby hut on the outskirts, far from the community that had once embraced them. Meanwhile, Michael focused on helping Helen rebuild her life. He discovered that Kofi had left a small piece of property in Helen's name, but Araba had claimed it as her own. "That land belongs to Helen," Michael told his lawyer. "Make sure it's returned to her." Within weeks, Helen became the rightful owner of her father's property. Michael also set up a trust fund for her, ensuring she could pursue her dream of becoming a doctor. When he brought her the news, Helen was overwhelmed. "Michael, I don't know how to thank you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to thank me," Michael replied, smiling warmly. "You saved my life, Helen. This is the least I can do." As the months passed, Helen enrolled in school and began preparing for her future. The villagers, eager to make amends, often stopped by to offer their support. "We were wrong," one elderly woman admitted, her eyes filled with regret. "Can you ever forgive us, Helen?" Helen nodded slowly. "I can forgive, but I won't forget." Despite everything, Helen remained kind and focused. She knew her journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt hope. As for Michael, he stayed true to his promise. He visited Helen often, offering guidance and friendship. Their bond grew stronger, built on trust and shared experiences. But deep in his heart, Michael knew he wanted more than friendship. He admired Helen's strength and resilience and hoped that one day she would see him as more than just a benefactor. For now, though, he was content to stand by her side, watching as she turned her pain into purpose. Helen faced a few challenges when she returned to school. Some students mocked her due to her age, and adjusting to a structured environment was difficult at first. But with Michael's constant support and her determination, she overcame every obstacle. In time, Helen excelled in her studies, earning the admiration of her teachers and classmates. "You're an inspiration, Helen," her teacher once told her, smiling warmly. As Helen grew more confident, Michael saw the glow of happiness return to her face. One evening, while they strolled through the village, Michael stopped abruptly and turned to her. "Helen," he said, his voice steady but nervous, "you've been my strength, my joy, and my hope. I can't imagine life without you. Will you marry me?" Helen's breath caught in her throat. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Michael, I will." Their wedding took place in the city, under the soft glow of fairy lights strung across a beautiful garden. The ceremony was intimate but elegant, attended by Michael's close friends and Helen's new companions from school. Helen wore a stunning white gown, and Michael, in a tailored black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. "You're the most beautiful woman in the world," he whispered as they exchanged vows. Life after their wedding was even more fulfilling. Michael continued to support Helen as she pursued her education, eventually helping her gain admission to a prestigious medical school. Despite the challenges, Helen remained focused and determined. "I'll make you proud, Michael," she promised one evening as she stayed up late, her textbooks spread out on the table. "You already have," he replied, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. Years later, Helen fulfilled her childhood dream of becoming a doctor. The day she received her certificate, she held it close to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I did it, Papa," she whispered, thinking of her father. Helen and Michael's joy multiplied when they welcomed twins. a boy and a girl. They named them Kofi and Ella, after Helen's father and the life she had left behind. Their home was filled with laughter and love. The twins adored their parents and often ran around the house giggling. "Papa, tell us the story of how you and Mama met," Ella begged one evening. Michael chuckled, pulling her onto his lap. "It's a long story, but it all began in a forest." Meanwhile, Araba's life had turned bitter. Old and frail, she lived in the shabby hut on the outskirts of the village. Her once commanding voice was now weak from years of shouting at Eric, who had become a burden. "Eric, clean up this mess!" Araba yelled as her son stumbled into the hut, reeking of alcohol. "Why should I? You ruined everything." Eric slurred, collapsing onto the floor. Araba sighed, tears in her eyes. She thought of the wealth and respect she once had. Now, she spent her days picking up after Eric and dealing with his endless troubles. The villagers, who once supported Araba, now pitied her. Some whispered behind her back, "She brought this on herself. Karma has its way." Helen, however, focused on building the life she had always dreamed of. With Michael's support, she opened a small clinic in the village, offering free care to those in need. "Dr. Helen," a little boy called out one day, running up to her. "Thank you for helping my mama feel better." Helen smiled, kneeling down to pat his head. "You're welcome. Always be kind, okay?" Her kindness and resilience inspired others, proving that no matter how dark life gets, there's always a chance for light. As Helen sat on the porch one evening, watching Michael play with their children, she felt a deep sense of peace. "This is the life I always wanted," she thought. "A family, love, and a purpose." Together, she and Michael had built a new beginning, one filled with hope, happiness, and endless possibilities. Thanks for watching, dear viewers. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and consider subscribing to the channel. I'll see you in our next video.